So tell me the story of how you got interested in infant mortality as a subject.
Like a lot of other people, after I moved back here, the Commercial Appeal did a series, as you know, about infant mortality. When I read the Commercial Appeal series, it really struck me how long this had been going on. I remembered when I lived here in my youth, in the last millennium, there was talk in the 60s about infant mortality. And here it was again on the front page of the paper 40 years later. And I just became intrigued why it seemed that not much had changed. And I was able to get Dr. Coronis, the founder of the neonatal intensive care unit at the Med. I was able to get him to visit with me for a few minutes and give me more background. And he pointed out that although they, over the years at the NICU, had gotten better and better at treating premature infants and saving more and more infants at a younger and younger age and lower birth weight, although they had gotten better at that, one of the best units in the country at that, at saving infants, the number arriving to be saved had not gone down. That in 40 years of doing this, he said, we hoped we would go out of business, but in fact, business was better than ever. And so I got interested in the idea of if infant mortality is the end medical result of a whole system of social problems, what are those social problems? Where does it come from? And so then I started meeting, along with my colleague and my producing partner in this, Professor David Appleby. We started meeting social workers, professionals, and volunteers who were working in the zip codes that had the highest infant mortality rate, and meeting some of the women who came from the groups that were most at risk, and trying to find out why do these terrible outcomes happen so much more often in these populations. We have a large poor population, and among the poor, particularly in our area and a lot of other big cities, blacks are overrepresented in that poor population. African Americans tend much more to be poor than Caucasians do. I mean, it's a fact of life in our country. And so when you look at the poor population, what you see is people living kind of day by day. Today, do I pay the rent or do I pay the utilities? Decisions are not made with a view to the future. There is not much planning for the future because so many people who are poor don't feel like they have a promise of much of a future, or they don't feel that they're in control of their future. So you combine that feeling of stress and hopelessness and not being able to plan ahead. You combine that with teenagers who are notorious for making bad decisions. Just look at how teenagers overall behave behind the wheel. Teenagers are not known for always making good decisions. So you combine that with this kind of day-to-day life of poverty, and what you get is a very high birth rate, very high teenage birth rate, a very low marriage rate. And you combine those things, and you're going to have a population that is highly at risk for giving birth to a low birth weight premature infant, and not being able to do the things that you need to do to prevent getting pregnant in the first place, and then to prevent a bad outcome when the baby comes to term. So my partner David Appleby and I, from the beginning, we wanted to do a program for public television. We wanted to do an hour documentary about infant mortality in Memphis, to see, because we knew a lot of people were trying to have an impact on the infant mortality rate in Memphis. A lot of things were being done, so we thought this would be a really good microcosm to look at what is being done, what works. We got a grant to do an hour program for public television, grants from the Urban Child Institute and grants from the University of Memphis to pursue this. So we were well along in our filming and editing and research when some former colleagues at ABC said, we would like to do this story. Will you do a version of it for us? And that's how it ended up being 2 programs. We did an ABC program that they called a special edition of 2020. And then when we finished that, we continued on with our public television program. I think it's natural for many people in the city to be embarrassed, of course, at being at the top of the list for a city with the highest rate of infant mortality. There is something embarrassing about that. We don't want the rest of the country to know that necessarily. Like someone told me, it's fine for us to talk about our problems among ourselves, but we don't want to hang out our dirty laundry for others to see. As a documentary filmmaker, that is not my job, is to avoid dirty laundry. My job is to bring light on a subject, a situation that a lot of people, I think, weren't aware of. Maybe not everyone saw and absorbed the Commercial Appeal series. Television reaches many more people. It's an enormous audience, and it reaches them in the living room, where they're vulnerable for information maybe that a lot of us don't want to hear. And I've always, in a situation like this, do we report the bad news? I've always fallen back on the words of a former colleague of mine, Bill Moyers, who said, the great thing about being a documentary filmmaker or any kind of journalist is that we don't have to solve the problem. What we have to do is keep the conversation going. And I think the documentary helped keep the conversation going. And I hope on a higher level of discourse than people kind of yelling at each other. I think the documentary is filled with very thoughtful people who are trying to figure this out and trying to make a difference. And in that sense, I have to say, yeah, it's worth talking about unpleasant news. Because in fact, a lot of people here, a lot of good hearts are trying to change it. One of the things that the health department allowed us to do was to meet visiting nurses and actually go along and look over their shoulder and watch them at work. And just from a layman's point of view, you could see that the one-on-one contact between the nurse and an expectant mother had a tremendous effect. You just couldn't help but feel there's going to be a difference in that outcome because of that contact. And when we started doing research and reading further about visiting nurse programs around the country, it became clear that every study supports the idea that there is no substitute for that one-on-one contact. The visiting nurse is not only giving medical information, but she can't help but be contributing values, her values, middle-class values, that often are missing in some of the poorest neighborhoods that have been abandoned by the middle class. So in fact, the statistics show that a young woman, a teenage mother who has been part of the visiting, as a recipient of the visiting nurse program, their rates of second pregnancy go way down. Something is happening there in the communication between the nurse and the pregnant teenager. They are learning how to prevent this from happening again too soon, because one of the factors that influences low birth weight, premature birth, is a second pregnancy or a third pregnancy, too soon. And some of the women most at risk are teenagers who have had 2 or 3 children in their teen years. Well, those rates go way, way down once the visiting nurse program is at work. So one of the mysteries to us was how this program has gotten smaller over the years, that the funding for that has diminished. There are fewer nurses doing that in the county, in the city and county, than there were 20 years ago, even 30 years ago. So at the same time, there hasn't been funding for a program that is proven to work. There has been funding for new things. Let's try new things. Let's see if we can figure out something that works. Let's fund this pilot program for a year and this pilot program for a year. It seems that the people who fund these things want everything to be a new program. They want to try something new. But it's only funded for a year, usually, maybe 2 years at the most. And when that funding runs out, it's very difficult to get organizations to fund a continuing program, to get operating money to continue it. So the nursing program, the visiting nurse program, is a very good example. Here we have something that we know works. You can see the effect it has. You can see it anecdotally, and you can see it statistically. And yet it's very difficult to get government funds, city funds, state funds, federal funds to continue that program at the level it should be to reach large numbers of women. The pilot programs, a number of interesting pilot programs have been done, centering pregnancy, the Blues Project. Those things have had a real effect on the women that they reach. But reaching a couple of dozen women in a year is not going to make a difference given the size of this problem.
What is?
Well, it goes back to, what is the underlying cause of infant mortality? We know from a medical point of view the cause is prematurity. That's the chief medical cause. But that's the end result of a whole host of social problems. The real cause is poverty. If you grow up poor, then one of the things you have to expect is that you have a shorter life expectancy. Maybe you don't have as healthy a life, and your children are at risk, and your infants are at risk of not having a first birthday. And that all goes with being poor. And I think we forget that when we blame the victims, when we blame the women. I mean, you hear, well, I know the answer to this. Those women just need to stop having those babies. When we say that, we are forgetting, if we ever knew, what it's like to be poor. You know, that's a middle-class point of view. We're accustomed to having all kinds of support around us. But when you're poor, you don't have that support. And you're living in a ghetto, the people next door are in the same bad situation you're in. So you can't borrow from them. You can't ask them for a ride to the doctor to get the prenatal care you need. You are trapped into a certain way of living that is just not good for you. And I thought one of all the interviews we did for our for our Beyond Babyland program, one of the most interesting to me was the interview with Yvonne Matlock. And we asked Ms. Matlock, okay, we're impatient. What one thing can we do? We want to lower the infant mortality rate. What one thing can we do to really make a difference? And here is the chief medical officer in the city who said, give every black man a job. That, in other words, it's not easy to rear a family, and it's certainly difficult without a job. It goes back to poverty. If we had really good jobs programs to take particularly men off the street corner and give them meaningful work that produced money to rear a family, if we had really good schools, if we had really good grocery stores in those poor neighborhoods, and so on and so on. All of those things that have to do with lowering the poverty rate would, without a doubt, have a huge effect on the infant mortality rate. One of the people who spoke about this was one of my former professors at the University of Memphis, John Bakke. And he pointed out, what we have here really is not the failure of a group of teen mothers. And it's not the failure to deliver maybe adequate medical care during those 9 months of pregnancy. What we have is a system failure. And Professor Bakke was saying, if you have two highways, there's a fork in the road, and then there are two highways. And on one of them, there's a really high rate of accidents. And on the other one, everything is going along pretty well, and there aren't many accidents. Then you don't say, gee, everyone who's driving on that road with all the accidents, they must be terrible drivers. They're making terrible mistakes. And the people driving on this road where everything is going well, they're doing everything right. You don't say that. We say, no, there's something wrong with the road. There must be something wrong with the system, or we wouldn't have all those failures over here. It's not the drivers. It could be the system. And I think that's what we have here. We've got to stop blaming the women for not being married, for having babies too young, and we need to look at the system, look at the environment in which we have placed them. When we middle-class folks leave those neighborhoods and say we don't want to support government programs for the common good that might help lift those people in those neighborhoods, when we do that, then we are getting what we ought to expect. We're getting what we deserve, which is an enormous set of social problems that sure may be concentrated on one side of town, but we're only as strong as our weakest link.